All right, welcome back, everyone, to episode 3 or Built for Digital. We are going to be focusing on today around policy and what does that mean? Whose job is it to get digital policy right? We often talk about sort of government or industry here. So before we get stuck in, Adam, how are we? We've just got back from the States and North America. How's things been since you got back?
Good. Yeah, it was a busy 3 weeks. Um, we met a lot of good people. We had a lot of good meetings. Um, we learnt a lot, and it was great to end the trip with a very productive workshop that we ran up in Ottawa. So back into the grind here, and um, I suppose in some way now that we're in that second half of the year, Gavin, our sights are now set on the SEQ 2032 Digital Assembly, which we're looking forward to. So things are good.
No, great. So, like I said, this session's focusing on policy. So, I want to really ask you the first question around whose job is it to get digital policy right? Is it purely from a government perspective? Is it industries or both? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. Policy is something that I somewhat came to late in life, professional life, and it was during my time in the non-profit world. So I kind of saw firsthand the role that industry plays in advocating to government and helping shape policy. And, there's no secret that government and political representatives and bureaucrats will say today very, plainly that, industry input and engagement with industry is critical. I firmly believe that. Um, I think both parties need each other. I think we get on each other's nerves at times. Industry can, certainly stick it to government at times. We get cranky, we get angry. They're going too slow. They don't have the right policy. And I've seen it where industry isn't organized or doesn't have a coherent message, and government gets frustrated. So look, it's I don't like using the word collaboration much because it's overused and not well understood, but it requires both parties to constructively be part of shaping good policy.
Yeah, and I think also that policy can't work on its own. Policy needs to be, if you're looking to invoke change, you need to be linking that with procurement as well.
Yeah.
Procurement sets the rules in terms of what you're asking suppliers to respond to, and you need a policy there to actually to help from a top down perspective. So, who's from a policy perspective, who's where do you see everyone sort of fitting into like support, provoke, replace? What like where's the line really? Who you talked about that tension between sort of supply chain, like industry, and government. Where's the tension there? Like what in terms of how does that actually who supports that? Is it NGOs in terms of need to support for new policy and getting industry bodies and in terms of their members to do that? Where's the line of that?
Yeah, I think there's, and I'm not a policy expert, but I've been involved in, sort of nudging over the years, and there have been instances where I've been part of conversations on the industry side where among industry peers we've had to sort of ask ourselves, right, we need to say something to government. And it could be in response to something that's been published or come out from government, and we're either not happy with it, it doesn't go far enough. It could be instances like that. So I do know in a couple of roles ago, past roles, where the organisation I was working with, we made a conscious decision to call government out publicly in a media release. Um, and that's probably the first time that I've ever been involved or around an action like that. So I can get there can be some tension, and there can be a bit of a rub there where government doesn't go as far as industry wants. But I think it takes a particular level of patience, right, when it comes to policy making, in my experience, which is, sometimes you just need to be happy with the small wins, and that could be, I mean, Gavin, remember when Infrastructure Australia released their 10-year infrastructure plan, I think it was, and they used the term digital by default, right? And that literally felt like the first time in a decade that a federal government entity used the word digital in the same sentence as infrastructure. And we wanted to celebrate, right? So you can sort of see that sometimes there's those really big wins that are actually quite small, um, in sort of detail, but um, there will be those times, and I could see that in some other areas, very passionate areas like social services and things like that, where maybe industry goes harder at government, or has more vocal displeasure, but um, it's certainly it's certainly a game. I don't mean that
Mm.
as in a negative way, but like you got to play the game, I suppose.
Well, you mentioned the digital by default that was released by Infrastructure Australia. Let's face it, that hasn't really gone anywhere from a, a national perspective. Each individual state governments have its own thing. Um, I don't really want to go over sort of past issues around why digital by default hasn't. Um, but what policies do you feel need to be brought in to sort of help within our sort of helping deliver infrastructure and places, etc., from a digital perspective? What sort of policies would you like to see? We're seeing in terms of a new AI policy, in terms of from an IP perspective, and what does that AI mean from an Australian government perspective? Only released over the last week or so, but from a from a policy perspective, what would you like to see in terms of moving forward from governments,
Yeah,
state
well,
or
yeah. Look, I know we don't want to go back over what was at the time at IA, but um, that is a really good case in point, right? Where there was, I'm just trying to remember now, but there was um, a consistent level of structured engagement with industry in the lead up to that that piece of work being released. I think AI did a really good job. They had, of course, there was different people there at the time, um, but I thought it was a good process, and I felt like it was a good win. We always knew, well, I always sort of had um, a heightened level of interest to see how the concept and the words digital by default would then translate into procurement or business case or project planning, and we always knew that that was going to be the sort of the real criteria for success. And I still firmly, if we just talk about infrastructure for a moment, which I think is a good one, because Australia, we spend a lot of taxpayers' money on infrastructure, and we typically do it well. And I still think that infrastructure continues to be a big lost opportunity in terms of leveraging digital enablement, whether it's writing in specific requirements, at the highest level, through that sort of that pipeline or priority project list. But I mean, a bit earlier or later. I can't remember the timing. I don't have it clear in my head, but the New South Wales government, it went through a process of developing and then it released a digital infrastructure policy. And at a state level, a bit like Queensland's BIM policy, for capital projects over a certain amount, it triggered the requirement to do X, Y, and Z. And New South Wales did have one, and it was triggering investment in data collection and technology deployment to gather data, which would then
Do you think that
feed back.
policy has provided value?
Sorry.
Do you think that policy has actually provided value?
Well, the point I was going to say was we got no idea where it's gone. You don't see it used. I understood that there was a review going on about it, but yeah, I've even sent emails off to their email inbox saying, "Can we get a briefing on where that's at?" So I think I think that using procurement and government project development and business case, and I think that's low hanging fruit. They're good touch points for requiring minimum levels of investment in digital and digital enablement, and there's not enough in the country. That's probably my statement on that. We've there's lost opportunity everywhere.
So, what do you think needs to happen then for more policy to happen then, Alan?
Well, I mean, it's still hard to go past the Victor Dominello years, right? You had a champion that drove this top down, right? So, you got top down, you know, political leadership, um, like Victor Dominello, providing the political coverage to the bureaucracy to go forth and get stuff done. And then from a bottom up industry perspective, you've got sort of industry wanting to, embrace and pilot and come on board and invest, and you catalyze the supply chain and everyone wins. So, um, the political champion, they're few and far between. I think when you sort of scan the political landscape in the country at state and federal level, and maybe even local government level as well, um, and so that top-down champion has always been. History shows that successful policy, often from a digital perspective, often gets developed where there is that custodian, um, and there's not many around.
So, what does this all mean? We've got the Olympic Games coming up in 2032. We've got in Queensland, we have a BIM policy. What does that mean for the games in absence of a policy? Are we going to be are we going to see issues surrounding that in terms of lack of productivity, blown out costs? Uh, no
It's a
Olympics has been delivered late,
yeah, yeah.
but in terms of have we is it the have we missed the bus for that now?
Um, I think, frankly, yes. Um, because there's been a lot of contracts let, there's a lot of procurement activity, and we're not seeing a lot of digital. And look, there's both political and financial and time poor reasons for that. I think the question, Gav, and I'd actually be interested in your view on this, but in saying that, and with that sort of somewhat bleak picture painted, does industry not come with a minimum level of built-in sort of digital innovation these days? The consultants, the contractors, the architects. This is a bigger question, which I'm kind of flipping now, but um, has has the digital built sector matured enough to give us confidence that even though the government isn't asking for it necessarily, that there will be sort of a minimum level of, standard practice that brings with it digital innovation?
Well, I think what will happen is that there's very mature organisations who have got very good digital practices, and but let's face it, it will be there for the benefit of their own productivity.
Yeah.
So there's a reason why these companies have digital practitioners on their projects, is to help them better deliver the project more productive, more efficiently, etc. I think the biggest issue is in terms of, as normal, is creating all these digital assets without necessarily having a streamlined approach about how you hand that information over, um, from an operations and maintenance perspective. So I think, I know I haven't seen the information requirements for the assets themselves. So I can only hope that in terms of those asset information requirements have been captured within there. But I think what I would like to, we were in LA earlier this year talking around what's going on with the LA 28 Olympics. What sort of what sort of digital legacy can we sort of take on from what LA, for our listeners here, in terms of what what did LA do in terms of what's been doing in terms of that Brisbane 2032 can look at? And should
Um,
we be sort of quietly stealing from them, if not we have already?
yeah, I mean that's a good question. I mean, when I think back to our visit to the Intuit Dome, where what's that? That's going to be the basketball venue for LA 28. That was a super impressive stadium. Um, the highest of quality that I've ever been in. Fan experience, infrastructure, all delivered by the private sector. You know, owned, operated by the private sector, and you know what? That's sort of that's kind of what industry does best, right? When you get out of its way, and when you got plenty of money, it delivers best in class. Not saying that can't happen under government ownership or funding, but um, I think the thing that really struck me for LA 28, I don't know how it directly translates to Brisbane 2032, but um, LA 28 is a private sector led games, government is a partner. Um, Classic Australian delivery model is government delivers, um, and via contract we get the private sector to build something. And we go to court 30 times and it blows out of time and budget and all that kind of stuff, right? So we've never really innovated in delivery model. Alliance contracting, yeah. Um, and that's worked wonders in some sectors. So you can see with Brisbane 2032 that the state government has certainly taken it upon themselves to be the custodian and deliver, and look, rightly so. Um, but not only am I interested in digital innovation, and there's other industry bodies in Australia that advocate for this more than sort of us, but procurement innovation and models of delivery and getting more private sector capital into our capital projects is sort of I've always been curious about why we only ever do it the same way, right? And yeah, the Australian way is for government to think they can do it all on their own. Um, so look, yeah, probably some lost opportunities with Brisbane 2032, but they're under the pump, short in time. Um, will there be lessons that LA 28 can sort of transfer over? I doubt it. I think there'll certainly be some of that real end of pipe stuff. I can imagine that some of the tech vendors and the showcase stuff, they'll certainly do the rounds here and they'll be sort of wooing key government stakeholders here to sort of, procure these types of systems in stadiums and venues. Um,
Yeah.
in saying that, actually, just a final point, in saying that, Gav, um, I haven't I haven't kept up with the mobility play in southeast Queensland when it comes to the Olympics, transport and mobility, that being one of the original, if not the original catalyst for originally bidding for the games, which is to sort of help solve the transportation challenge in southeast Queensland. So that's an area, sort of the digital transformation of mobility, is something that I'm certainly keen on, and maybe there will be opportunities as we get closer.
Do you think also as well the Dominican office just released $50 million worth of funding applications around digital? What do you see that as a good thing? Do you see that as a positive? Probably a bit of a cheeky question in terms of
Oh,
unscripted, but
look, I
um,
we've both we've both stood on the sidelines, haven't we, when we've watched, over the last 7, 8 years, the federal government released 50 million for digital funding originally, out of Canberra, and then New South Wales backed it up with 40 million. So we've seen those digital funding programs come and go, um, with mixed
we're seeing it in Canada as well, and
Canada.
with CHMC.
Yeah, yeah. So I think mixed success would be the way to describe it. And look, that's a really interesting, but I think classic opportunity that sometimes gets lost, which is bringing industry in to help shape programs like that. Because ideally, what you want is the government's putting up 50 million. If I'm government, I'm wanting to convert that 50 million into 500 million in value. And, I'd be wanting to design programs around capability development. Are all of those recipients going to hang out as a cohort? Are they going to get together every 6 months? Are they going to look for common areas of investment? Can they sort of bulk purchase and buy and go to market? And there's so many. This is where America does, I think, this so well, particularly because there's a lot of philanthropy, and they really demand, a two for, three for, four for, fold increase in sort of the benefit and value. So, is that an opportunity lost with this new round of 50 million under the SEQ City deal? Don't know yet. Um, but what we do know from the data previously with the Smart Cities and Suburbs program, that if the money wasn't available, a whole bunch of people wouldn't have even been interested. So if anything, it kind of does what it says on the packet, which is sort of stimulates people doing some stuff, whether it lasts and whether there's legacy and they replicate and scale those activities. Time will tell.
Yeah, it's interesting about what the role of government is, whether it wants to be a bank, whether it wants to be a coordinator, um, whether it's stimulation within the market. Um, yeah, it'll be interesting. The Smart Cities and Suburbs program probably made quite a few vendors well off, but not necessarily see that return of investment back into from a public service perspective. So I think it's interesting in terms of whether government listens to practitioners and industry, or whether it just decides to do what it wants to do.
Uh,
I think as we
yeah, I was going to say to you, I mean, you know better than anyone, back in your home country right now, the UK government is spending oodles of money funding smart infrastructure, AI in particular. And I think what's interesting there is that the government owns it. They're not apologetic. They have very clear macro geopolitical business goals, and they're investing in it. And I like that. I think that's fine to spend taxpayers' money to want to be the best in the world and build capability and export that. Um, you know, in the digital world, do we sort of see that? I mean, can you translate that practice down to a state government level? I don't know, but um, I think when you've got a clear end state in mind, or you've got business goals and they're international, that can really sort of help fire things.
Yeah, okay. Well, time will tell with that. Well, look, I think this is probably a good point to sort of wrap this conversation up, Adam. And we've talked a lot about, and I'm always quite adverse to bash government because it's an easy thing to do, and government have a hard job, and it's an easy target. But Adam Beck, if a minister was listening into this conversation and only watched this episode, what's the one thing you would want them to hear?
Um, that when we talk about digital and investing in digital, um, we're investing in, economic opportunity. Um, it's jobs, it's export potential, it's productivity. I think sometimes we think we think too often that these are IT projects, and um, that mindset sort of is a showstopper, from the start. So this needs a reframing. Digital is economic infrastructure, and it is very clear. It's a very clear path if they choose to take it. Um, it's a very clear path to economic prosperity for their constituents. That means, saving money. That means better services, and ultimately, um, smarter government operations. So, digital is economic infrastructure. It's not an IT project.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the hardest thing that we struggle to do is communicate about to the people on the streets about what this can provide them. And I think that's what we always need to try to do better. So, with that, Adam, thank you very much for today. We look forward to the last of this series, episode 4, where it's titled "Nobody Wants to Talk About the Plumbing," which is all the critical groundwork and
Yep.
the hard stuff that sort of bring the shiny things to life. So with that, we look forward to chatting about the next episode.
Thanks, Gav.